In 2014, an oil crew drilling in the high desert near Terlingua hit something they couldn't explain. It wasn't rock, wasn't pipeline. When they pulled it up, it was metal. Rusted, buried deep, and shaped like the frame of a missing pickup. My daughter's pickup. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Thomas Walker. I'm 62 now, but I've been working cattle since I was old enough to hold a fence post steady. I live about 8 miles outside of Alpine, Texas, on the same ranch my father built with his bare hands and a stubborn streak. It's rough country, dry, quiet, and wide enough to lose time in. Folks around here call it honest land, the kind that doesn't lie to you. And I believed that. My daughter Savannah helped me run it. She was 28 back then, strong-willed, could ride better than most men twice her size. I used to tell people she was born with dirt under her nails and wind in her blood. It was just the two of us after her mama passed. We ran the place together side by side. Every morning started before sunrise. Coffee at the stove boots at the door, and then out to check on the herd. The rhythm of ranch life doesn't change much until it does. The year she disappeared, the drought had been brutal. Grass didn't hold, and we had to rotate grazing spots every few days. Savannah handled the west pastures. She preferred it out there, fewer neighbors, fewer arguments over fences and water rights. We'd built a system, simple but solid check-ins every night by 11. If she was running late, she'd radio in. She always did. But that fall, things started feeling off. The kind of off you don't notice all at once. Like when your old dog stops barking at coyotes, or when mail shows up late more than once a week. I'd catch Savannah staring off at the ridgeline sometimes like she was hearing something I couldn't. She said it was nothing, just tired, just stretched thin. I believed her. One afternoon, I found the gate to the north corral half open. We always kept it chained. No signs of forced entry, no cattle loose, just unlatched. Could have been a gust of wind, I told myself. Could have been one of the hands forgetting. But it itched at me. There was also a sheriff's patrol that started showing up more often. Sheriff Ridge said he was just checking in. Too many break-ins near the state line, he claimed. But his questions felt personal. He'd ask how often Savannah worked alone, whether I locked up our fuel barrels, whether I'd noticed any strangers hanging around. I didn't think much of it at the time. We'd known Ridge for years, went to school together back in the day. But something in his tone, I don't know. It felt like someone fishing for something they already knew. Then came that Thursday evening, October 9th, hotter than it should have been for fall. I remember Savannah loading feed into the back of her truck like it was any other day. She waved, said she'd be back by midnight. I didn't think to stop her. Around 11:30, I poured a second cup of coffee and checked the clock again. No call, no radio, no lights pulling up the drive. I stepped outside. The night was dead still. No wind, no sound. And that's when I knew something wasn't right. I stood there a long time, that night porch light flickering behind me, watching the empty stretch of dirt road where Savannah should have come rolling in by now. There wasn't a sound out there. No wind, no coyotes, not even the low hum of insects. Just silence and the growing weight in my chest. I told myself she was probably fine, just working late like she sometimes did. Maybe a flat tire. Maybe she decided to camp out at the west pasture instead of making the drive back in the dark. That had happened before. But something about this time didn't sit right. I ended up staying up past midnight going over some ranch accounts to keep my hands busy, but I couldn't focus. By 2 a.m., I finally caved and drove out toward the grazing land. The cattle were still there, quiet, pressed along the fencing like they'd been fed and settled in. But there was no sign of Savannah. No truck. No gear. I drove the full boundary twice, thinking maybe she'd taken the long loop around to avoid one of the washed-out roads. But there was nothing. Just miles of dry scrub and moonlight. By morning, I made the call. I told the dispatcher I needed to file a missing persons report, that my daughter never came home and she wasn't answering her phone. That was the start of it. The sheriff's department sent out a couple deputies to walk the pastures with me. At first, nobody seemed too worried. Grown woman, they said. Maybe she took off for the weekend. But I knew better. Savannah never left without telling me. Not since her mother died. We were all each other had. Over the next few days, the search expanded. Helicopters flew grid patterns. Volunteers combed the gullies. Her photo went up on posters around town, taped to gas station windows and pinned to church boards. A few folks said they'd seen her truck the day she vanished. Headed west around 8:30, same as always. Nothing unusual, no suspicious vehicles trailing her, no break-ins, no ransom notes. Just gone. That first year, the department stayed active on the case. I gave interviews, sat with detectives, answered every question they had, even the ones that felt like veiled accusations. I kept expecting something to break. A tire track, a footprint, anything. But nothing ever came. By the third year, the visits stopped. New cases came in, priorities shifted. One by one, people moved on. But I never did. So when that patrol car rolled onto my ranch 9 years later, I felt something old and cold rise up in me. Deputy Martinez stepped out first. He was one of the few who'd worked the case early on. The younger officer with him looked fresh out of academy. I wiped the grease from my hands, walked up slow. Martinez took off his hat before he spoke. That put me on edge right away. No one removes their hat unless they've got bad news. He said they'd found something in the desert. Said an oil crew drilling outside Terlingua had hit metal about 15 feet down. Thought it was a pipe at first, but when they dug it out, it was a vehicle. Said it matched the make and model of Savannah's truck. I didn't know what to say. For a moment, I actually laughed, short and bitter. After 9 years, that truck could have been anywhere. But Martinez wasn't joking. He asked me to come with them to confirm it. I told Manuel, my ranch foreman, to keep an eye on things and climbed into the patrol car. The drive took an hour and a half, winding through old mining roads and sun-bleached brush. As we got closer, I saw the drilling equipment. Yellow tape roped off a wide perimeter. State police were there. News vans, too. I didn't get out right away. Just sat and looked at the mess of vehicles and uniforms and portable floodlights staked into the sand. When I did finally step out, the heat hit me like a wave. The ground was soft underfoot, scraped up by backhoes and diggers. Detective Rodriguez met me near the edge of the site. He was with the state now, but had worked Savannah's case back when it was fresh. He introduced me to the foreman from Parian Drilling, a man named Jim Patterson. Jim explained that the site was listed as inactive since the 60s. Said his crew had found a massive boulder sitting on top of the old wellhead strange because no one in the business would cap a well that way. They moved the boulder, started drilling, and that's when they struck something dense. Said it didn't feel like rock. Dug it out with an excavator, slow and careful. Turned out to be a vehicle buried so deep it looked like someone had tried to erase it from the world. The truck was suspended in the air, chained up like a carcass. Rusted. Windshield shattered from the drill rig's initial hit. Dried desert earth clung to the undercarriage. But even under all that, I knew. That was her truck. The paint color, the bumper sticker we'd put on together. They'd set up a folding table under a tent nearby. Inside were evidence bags, her wallet still fastened shut. A silver cross necklace that had once belonged to her mother. A multi-tool I'd given her one Christmas. There was even a tire pressure gauge I always told her to keep in the glove box. I didn't need to say much. Just pointed. Confirmed what was hers. That's when the sheriff arrived. Ridge. He came late, said he'd been tied up on a pile-up along Highway 118. I hadn't seen him in years. He looked older, slower, but still wore that same practiced drawl. He offered condolences, said it was a big discovery, but I could tell he was sizing me up. Rodriguez asked him about expanding the search perimeter, said this wasn't just an accident. Someone had buried that truck deliberately. Ridge nodded along, but there was a tension in his shoulders I didn't like. He kept glancing at the table of evidence like something on it bothered him. Rodriguez offered to drive me home, but Ridge cut in, said he had some follow-up questions, preferred to speak in private. I agreed, but the second we got back to my office, his tone changed. He wanted me to walk through the night Savannah vanished, every hour, every detail. I told him I'd already done that 100 times, but he pressed, asked where I was, who could vouch for me, why I didn't call sooner, why I assumed she was safe. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I told him straight I didn't bury my daughter's truck in the desert. I couldn't have, even if I wanted to. And that idea, that I'd somehow done all this and kept it secret for nearly a decade, it was insulting. He started asking about my ranch hands. Manuel, the others, where they were that night, whether I'd noticed any strange behavior. I'd had enough. Told him to go pull the damn traffic footage from that area, same as they did 9 years ago. Look for trucks, bulldozers, anything that could have hauled a vehicle and buried it without a trace. But he just said that wasn't necessary. Claimed it'd be hard to track down that kind of footage after so long. Said they'd look into it, but his tone made it clear they wouldn't. When he left, I didn't shake his hand, just watched his SUV kick up dust as he pulled away. I stood there on the porch a while, fists clenched, heat pressing down from above. The truck had finally been found, but Savannah was still missing. No answers. Just more suspicion, more finger-pointing, and a feeling in my gut that whatever we'd unearthed out there wasn't the end of the mystery. It was just the beginning. That truck had been buried for a reason, and whoever put it there wasn't finished talking yet. I didn't sleep much that night. After the sheriff drove off, I sat on the porch until the stars came out and the heat finally broke. There was a weight on me I couldn't shake, the kind that settles behind your ribs and doesn't budge. The truck had come back, but Savannah hadn't. And instead of answers, all I had was suspicion pointed in my direction by a man who was supposed to be helping. By morning, I still couldn't think straight. I skipped breakfast, told Manuel to run the fencing crew without me, and got in the truck. I didn't even know where I was going until I pulled up outside the Dusty Spur Tavern. It was early, barely past opening, and the place was near empty. I wasn't there for the whiskey, not really. I just needed the silence, the kind that comes when there's nobody left to talk to and nothing left to pretend. Jake, the bartender, was wiping down the counter when I came in. He nodded and poured without asking. We'd known each other 20 years, and in that kind of time you learn when not to ask questions. I was halfway through the drink when I heard the voice from the back, someone complaining about the news being turned off. That struck me as odd. Most folks around here were avoiding the news that week. But this guy, he got up, sat 2 stools down from me, and kept sneaking glances at the TV like he needed to see what had been missed. He looked out of place. Mid-40s, maybe clean-shaven, road-weary. The kind of man who's been sleeping in motels but still keeps his shirt tucked in. I turned to him just to break the quiet. Told him I didn't think I'd seen him around before. He smiled like someone relieved to talk. Said his name was Barry. Barry Granger. He was looking for his brother Terry, who used to be a cop here in Alpine. That made me pause. Terry Granger had worked traffic enforcement back when Savannah went missing. He'd been one of the few officers who actually showed up when I called, pulled traffic footage, ran tags, came out to the ranch twice to follow up. Then, just like everything else, he vanished. Barry said the department told him Terry left for Mexico about 9 years ago. No notice, no forwarding address. That timeline hit me like a nail in the gut. Same year Savannah disappeared. Same stretch of silence. And now no one could or would say where he'd gone. I told Barry I remembered Terry, and I remembered him pulling footage from cameras near the West Road where Savannah had last been seen. Barry said they weren't close, not back then. Family stuff, old grudges. But lately he'd wanted to reconnect. Only no one at the department would tell him much. They just gave him a polite smile and said Terry was long gone. But Barry didn't buy it. And I didn't either. I offered to take him to the station. I needed to talk to Rodriguez anyway, and it felt like maybe our stories were tangled in the same web. The station hadn't changed much, same cracked tile in the entryway, same faded bulletin board. Officer Hernandez was at the front desk. I introduced Barry and asked if Rodriguez was in. She said he'd stepped out about an hour earlier, but she could call him. Then she looked at Barry and said she remembered him from the day before. Gave him the same line, no forwarding info for Terry, just that he quit the force and left town. Barry thanked her, but you could see it in his face. He didn't believe a word of it. I didn't either. I asked if Sheriff Ridge was in. She pointed through the glass, said he was just pulling in now. Barry and I stepped outside, expecting to intercept him. Ridge's SUV parked a few spots down from mine windows, cracked engine running, but he didn't get out. Just sat there talking on the phone. I started to walk toward my truck, told Barry I needed to grab my phone charger. As I passed behind Ridge's vehicle, I caught his voice through the open window. At first I tried to ignore it, but the words carried. He said, "Handle it quickly. Bones. Yes, find bones." Then something else low, like someone was responding through the speaker system. A young male voice, shaky, hard to hear. I paused by my truck, one hand still on the door handle. Then Ridge's voice again, clearer this time. "Not Terry Granger. No one cares. Don't worry. New guy in the office." I didn't move. Not right away. Just stood there staring into the truck's interior, letting those words hang in the dry air. Not Terry Granger. Something about it felt off. Like a thread coming loose you didn't mean to pull, but now it won't stop unraveling. I got in my truck fast and told Barry to do the same. He looked confused, but I didn't wait. I told him I'd heard something I wasn't supposed to. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot just as Ridge's SUV backed out and rolled toward the main road. Barry asked what I'd heard. I told him your brother's name, and something about bones. We followed from a distance. Ridge drove fast, too fast for someone with no place urgent to be. He wasn't weaving, but he had purpose. I tried calling him just to see if he'd answer. He looked at the phone, then ignored it. I called Rodriguez next, put it on speaker, told him where we were, what I'd overheard. Barry leaned in and told him he was Terry's brother, that he didn't believe the story about Mexico. Rodriguez listened quiet at first, then said he remembered Terry, said the move had always seemed abrupt, said he'd been told Terry was chasing some new passion, but you could hear the doubt in his voice. Then Ridge's SUV turned. Left the main road, kicked up gravel, headed toward an old farmhouse at the edge of town. Rodriguez warned us not to engage, told us to stay back. He said he'd dispatch units immediately, said if what we were seeing was real, it had to be handled carefully. I told him we'd keep eyes on and ended the call. We coasted past the turnoff, found a spot behind a line of mesquite trees, and shut everything down. The sky was starting to dim, and through the fading light we could see the farmhouse. Lights in the windows. A second car pulled in. 3 or 4 men got out, opened the back door and pulled someone out, bound blindfolded, stumbling. They walked that person to Ridge's SUV and loaded them into the trunk. Neither Barry nor I spoke for a long time. The sun dipped below the hills, and we watched as Ridge's SUV pulled away, heading deeper into the desert. I turned the key. We followed slow and quiet, the taillights flickering in the dust. Barry sat stiff in the seat beside me, one hand braced against the dashboard. He didn't have to say it. We both knew. That person in the trunk. It could have been Terry, or Savannah, or someone else lost between the cracks of this place. And whatever Ridge was doing out here, it wasn't lawful. It wasn't protocol. And it sure as hell wasn't over. We stayed on him as long as we could. Ridge didn't seem to know he was being followed, or if he did, he didn't show it. He kept heading west past where the paved road turned to dirt, deeper into that scrub country, where the lights thin out and the distances stretch. Barry kept one eye on the taillights ahead, the other on my phone, giving Rodriguez updates every few minutes. The detective was working the phones fast, trying to get units in place, but Ridge was moving faster than anyone expected. At one point, the SUV slowed brake lights flickering red against the pale dust, then turned sharply down a narrow ranch road lined with rusted fencing and broken cattle wire. I dropped back, cut my headlights, and eased onto the shoulder just beyond the turn. There wasn't much to see, just outlines of old buildings half swallowed by the dark. Ridge drove straight up to one of the outbuildings near the main house and stopped. We stayed back maybe 200 yards out, parked behind a scatter of creosote brush, the truck idling in the dark. The sky was almost black now, stars beginning to show. I killed the engine and opened the window. Barry sat tense beside me, fingers tapping against his knee. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. We both saw it. Ridge got out of the SUV, walked to the back, and opened the trunk. It took him a few seconds, like he was struggling with something heavy. Then we saw him pull someone out. Whoever it was, they couldn't walk. Their arms were pinned, their legs buckled. He dragged them toward one of the stables, the door hanging crooked from rusted hinges. I don't know how long we sat there, watching, barely breathing. Long enough to see Ridge disappear into that stable with whoever he had, and long enough to know that we were too close to stop. I reached for the door. Barry grabbed my arm before I could move. Told me not to be stupid. Said we didn't know what was waiting out there, how many others might be inside, what kind of weapons they had. He was right, and I hated it. But he was right. Rodriguez was still on the line. I told him where we were, what we'd seen. He said backup was on the way, units were closing in from both directions, and we were to stay put. No matter what, that part was firm. I put the phone on the dash and tried to sit still, but every part of me was screaming to move. I kept picturing Savannah, kept wondering what Ridge had done, how long he'd been doing it, who else might have looked the other way. The wait felt like hours, though I know it wasn't. One by one, headlights appeared out on the horizon. No sirens, no flashing lights, just quiet movement in the dark. Police vehicles pulled in slow, boxed the property in from the far edge. You could see the officers fanning out rifles drawn, checking the outbuildings first. Then came the signal. One of them raised his hand and they moved. We heard the calls, the warnings shouted. The stable doors were breached in a matter of seconds, and then came the sound, something between a scream and a sob from inside the building. The kind of sound you don't forget. They brought Ridge out first, hands behind his back, face flushed and twisted. He saw us standing near the truck and locked eyes with me like he still had something to say. Told me I didn't know who I was dealing with. Said I'd regret it. Then the deputy pushed him forward toward a waiting cruiser. I didn't say anything back. There wasn't anything worth saying. A second officer came out of Ridge's SUV holding a phone. Said they found texts, mentions of someone being moved out tonight, mentions of bones planted evidence. He handed the phone to Rodriguez, who'd arrived just as the last of the stable had been cleared. The rest came fast. One officer shouted they had someone alive. 2 others came out of the stable arms, supporting a woman between them. She looked so thin I thought she might collapse. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn. But the second she stepped into the light, I knew. It was Savannah. Her legs buckled and I ran toward her. Didn't wait for permission. She looked up, eyes wide, and her mouth moved before the words came. "Dad," she said. "I knew you'd find me." I caught her before she fell. She smelled like dirt and medicine, and something else I didn't want to name. I held her as tight as I could without hurting her, felt the bones beneath her skin. The paramedics moved in. Took her from me, gently got an IV, checked her vitals. She didn't want to let go of my hand. Rodriguez stood close, asked her if she was able to answer questions. She nodded weakly, said the sheriff had kept her alive. Said he'd told the others not to kill her because she was his leverage. She used the word toy, and I saw Rodriguez flinch when she said it. said there was a man named Miguel, that they were running drugs through old ranch sites, that Ridge had been protecting them for years, making cases disappear, controlling what got seen and what got buried. She said she'd been moved between locations, always under sedation, always under watch. Sometimes there was a nurse who tried to help. They'd killed her last year. Rodriguez had already called in another team, said one of the messages on Ridge's phone had a set of GPS coordinates listed as a burial site. When they got there, officers found a hole halfway filled. Inside it were bones mixed in with women's clothes, boots, jewelry, enough to fool a shallow investigation. Rodriguez said it was pig bone, close enough to human under the right conditions. Savannah heard that and closed her eyes. She understood what it meant, that they'd planned to fake her death, that if Ridge had gotten one more night, we'd have found a pile of bones in the desert and no reason to keep searching. Barry came up beside me while I stood by the ambulance. He looked pale but steady, said they were sending a team to the farmhouse, said if his brother was still alive, they'd find him. His voice cracked, but he held it together. Savannah squeezed my hand again, her grip stronger this time. She said she wanted to tell everything, all of it, said she was ready. I nodded, but told her not now. Told her we'd take 1 hour at a time. The medics were almost ready to transport her when Rodriguez came over again. He looked me in the eye and said, "We got here just in time." I believed him, but I also knew what he meant. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ridge was one piece of it, the cartel was another, and whoever else had looked the other way for 9 years, we were just starting to find them. The truck had come out of the ground, and now the rest had to follow, one truth at a time. I stayed with Savannah through the night. They moved her into a private room on the 3rd floor, kept her under observation while the sedatives wore off. Every time the machines beeped, every time she shifted under the blankets, I sat up straighter. I don't think I slept more than 10 minutes at a time. Around 4 in the morning, the nurse came in to check her vitals and said the doctor would be by before dawn. I nodded, said thank you, and got up to stretch my legs. The hallway was quiet. Dim overhead lights, faint hum of air vents, a vending machine at the end with its light burned out. I walked down to the waiting area and sat there a while just staring at the floor. The place smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. For a few minutes I let myself breathe. When I came back to her room, Savannah was awake. Her eyes were clearer. Her voice had that rasp in it I remembered from when she had strep as a kid, dry like sandpaper across the throat. She said she wanted to talk to the detective. I told her we could wait until she was stronger. She shook her head, said she needed to get it out, said it was all still right there. I helped her sit up, called Rodriguez, and by the time he arrived with the recording equipment, she was ready. He brought another officer with him, a younger guy I hadn't seen before. They set up in the corner, kept their voices low, gave her time to settle. Then she started. She said it happened the night she went out to the west pasture. She remembered seeing lights, 2 vehicles parked in the arroyo behind an old well pad. Said she knew right away it wasn't ranch traffic. No branding equipment, no feed, no trailer. Just 2 trucks and men moving something between them. She couldn't see much, but the way they kept flashing lights on and off like signals made her stop cold. She said she backed away, didn't even collect the herd. Just ran to her truck and tried to get out before they saw her. But one of them did. A man named Miguel. He followed her, ran her off the road near a dry creek bed, then dragged her from the truck before she could radio or honk. She said he zip-tied her wrists, blindfolded her, and threw her into the back of his truck. That was when she heard the call. Miguel used a 2-way to contact someone. She couldn't see who he was talking to, but she heard the voice. It was Ridge. Called her the Walker Girl. Miguel wanted to finish it right there, said she was a liability. Ridge told him no, said she was valuable, that he'd take care of it. She said they drove her to a farmhouse outside of town, one with a grain silo built into the back of the property, underground. She was kept there at first, The windows were sealed. There was a cot, a small sink, a bucket. Sometimes food, sometimes nothing. Days and nights blurred together. She said Ridge came by in person at least twice a month, sometimes more, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. Rodriguez didn't interrupt, just let her keep going, nodding now and then, asking quiet questions when she paused. She said over time they moved her between locations. Old storage barns, ranch sheds, sometimes the backs of trailers when they were relocating shipments. Said they kept her sedated often. Long stretches where she couldn't tell what was real. She remembered a nurse, a woman with gray hair who brought her antibiotics, helped bandage her wrists after the restraints rubbed them raw. That nurse disappeared one day and never came back. One of the men, Miguel, or someone else, said she got too soft and had been taken care of. Savannah said Ridge used her as insurance. If anyone in the operation turned on him, he'd use her as leverage. If law enforcement got too close, he had a plan to fake her death. Said he told the others about an old capped well on state land, one that had already collapsed inward. He'd given them the location and told them to dump her truck there, fill it in, make it look like it had been there for years. Said they used an excavator to move sand over it, packed it down by hand. Ridge himself controlled which traffic cams stayed up and which ones had technical issues that week. He'd had access to the footage, knew which roads were monitored and which weren't. It was all done deliberately. At that point, Rodriguez looked up from his notes and asked her about the plan that night, the night we found her. She said Ridge had made contact with someone outside of town. There'd been talk of moving her across the border using a mule route they'd used before for high-value product. But they couldn't just move her without closing the case for good. That's when the fake burial came up. Someone had been tasked with preparing a site with Pigbone's old livestock remains dressed in women's clothing, items that matched what she used to wear. The idea was to stage a shallow grave, leak it through unofficial channels, let the story close itself. The fact that she was still alive would be irrelevant. They'd bury the case with the bones. I had to leave the room for a few minutes after that. I stepped out into the hall, leaned against the wall near the nurse's station, stared at the linoleum tiles like they were going to change color. A nurse asked if I needed anything. I told her no, just air. When I came back, Savannah was wiping her eyes. Rodriguez had packed up his notebook but hadn't left yet. He asked her one last question if she remembered anyone else. Someone unexpected, someone from town. Savannah hesitated, then said there was one man, a cop, older than the others. He wasn't part of the group, but showed up once early on. Said he didn't want to be involved. Ridge told him to leave and never speak of it. She didn't catch a name, just remembered he had a limp and wore a hat indoors. Rodriguez turned to me and asked if that sounded familiar. I said yes. It sounded like Terry Granger. That was the thread that hadn't been pulled yet. Barry was still in the building. He'd stayed down in the ER waiting to hear if they found his brother. I told Rodriguez to follow up fast because if what Savannah said was true, then Terry hadn't left town willingly. He'd seen something and gotten too close. And if Ridge had been keeping Savannah as leverage, then maybe he'd kept someone else too. Someone who knew too much to let go but too risky to kill. Rodriguez didn't say anything right away. Just wrote something in his notebook and stepped out to make a call. The hallway door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time since all this began, the room was quiet again. Savannah lay back against the pillows. Her face looked older than her years, and her hands were still trembling. I pulled a chair close and sat beside her, not saying anything. Just holding her hand, same way I used to when she was little and had a fever. Outside that window, the town of Alpine went on like it always had. Quiet streets, wind through the pecan trees, porch lights flickering on one by one. But I knew something had shifted. Whatever we'd uncovered in that desert was just the top layer. Underneath it, the rest was waiting. We hadn't seen it all yet, not even close. Rodriguez didn't say where he was headed, just told me he'd call if they found anything, and then he was gone. The hallway went quiet again. I stayed in Savannah's room a little longer, but she'd finally drifted off sedatives, catching up to her again. I stood by the window for a while watching the sunrise creep across the lot. The town looked the same: gas pumps, water tower, the grocery store off Highway 90, but everything underneath had shifted. I couldn't shake that feeling, the one you get when you know there's still something buried just out of reach. The sheriff had run that crew like a business. He hadn't acted alone. And if Terry Granger really had seen something, if he'd been the reason the fake story about Mexico was passed around, then maybe there was still a chance he was alive. I went back to the ranch that morning, not because I wanted to, but because someone had to keep things running. Manuel had everything handled, he always did, but I needed to look like I was holding together, at least on the outside. I kept my phone in my shirt pocket and checked it every few minutes. Around noon, I got the call. Rodriguez said they were going to raid a second property tied to the crew. It matched a location Savannah had described during her interview, a remote spot off Old Creek Road used as a temporary drop point. Said they'd found fresh tire tracks, ATV marks, signs someone had been there recently. He didn't say Terry's name, but I could hear in his voice that something was moving. I told Manuel I needed to step away for a bit and drove straight back to town. Barry was already outside the station when I pulled up, pacing the sidewalk like a man who couldn't sit still. His face looked drawn, like he'd barely slept. I told him what Rodriguez had said, and we both knew what it meant. Barry wanted to go with them to the raid, but Rodriguez shut that down fast. Said it was a tactical operation, too dangerous for civilians. Promised we'd be the first to know if they found anything. We stood there in silence after the call ended, just leaning against my truck, not saying much. Every few minutes, Barry would look up toward the road like he was expecting headlights to appear. I knew that feeling. I'd lived in it for 9 years. Eventually, Barry asked if we could drive. Just anywhere. Said he couldn't sit in that parking lot anymore. So we went. Headed west out of Alpine, same direction Ridge had taken when he dumped the truck. We didn't say where we were going, just let the road stretch out ahead. The desert opened up flat and empty. We passed fence lines, dried up tanks, windmills that hadn't turned in years. After a while, Barry asked what I'd do if they found Terry, if he was alive but changed. I didn't know how to answer. I told him what Savannah had said about the nurse, about how kindness had cost that woman her life, about how they kept people in line with fear and silence. Barry didn't speak after that, just stared out the window, jaw set like stone. My phone rang again around 3. Rodriguez. He said they'd secured the site. There'd been resistance, 2 men armed, one tried to run, but no one got out. And they'd found something. A room in the back of the structure concealed behind metal sheeting. Inside was a man, mid-40s, malnourished, bruised, and alive. Barry's hands were shaking before I even told him. I pulled off to the shoulder and handed him the phone. He didn't say much to Rodriguez, just listened, nodded a few times, then handed the phone back, eyes glassy. They were bringing Terry to Alpine General. Said he needed medical attention, but he was conscious. When I asked how bad it was, Rodriguez said, "He's got a pulse." That's the good part. We got to the hospital 20 minutes before the ambulance did. Barry couldn't sit still. Kept walking the sidewalk, checking the door, looking for any sign of movement. When the EMTs finally rolled up, he ran straight to the gurney. The man on it was thin, barely more than skin and bone. His face was sunken, eyes bruised, and I could see where the restraints had cut deep into his wrists. But it was Terry. There was no doubt. Barry didn't speak, just walked alongside as they wheeled him in. The nurse tried to stop him, but she saw something in his face and let it go. I stayed back. That wasn't my moment. I sat in the waiting room again, this time in a different wing. Plastic chairs, bad coffee, the same soft music humming through the ceiling speakers. I stared at the floor, same as before. After a while, Rodriguez came in. Sat down next to me, didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he handed me a copy of the preliminary evidence log. Said they found personal effects in the farmhouse. Uniform pieces, old police documents, A storage trunk with a folder marked Granger, internal. Looked like Ridge had kept files on anyone who'd come too close. Rodriguez said the folder included a report Terry never filed one that documented missing traffic footage, conflicting timestamps, and a written request from Ridge asking him not to pursue ranch-related inquiries. There was more. A list of names, officers, deputies, one city councilman. All people Ridge had looped in either knowingly or under pressure. Rodriguez said it was enough to trigger a full state investigation. Maybe more. I asked him if the cartel was behind it. He nodded. Said Ridge had been their inside man, helped traffic through quiet routes, reroute patrols, suppress complaints. He wasn't just covering for them. He was on their payroll, regular deposits, property swaps, a second bank account under a false name. It had gone on for years, and nobody had looked close enough. Until now. Back in Savannah's room, she was sleeping when I returned. The nurse said her vitals were stable. Appetite was coming back. Infection was responding to treatment. It was going to be slow, but she'd pulled through the worst of it. I sat with her again until the sun started dropping behind the hills. The light came in low through the blinds, warm and gold soft on her face. I looked at her and thought about everything we still didn't know. Every hand that helped Ridge stay in power. Every name on that list. And whether they knew what he'd done or chose not to know. Later that night, Barry called me. Said Terry was awake for a few minutes. Said he recognized him, spoke his name, cried a little, then asked what year it was. Barry's voice cracked when he told me that. I didn't say much, just listened. After he hung up, I stepped outside the hospital and lit a cigarette I'd kept buried in my glove box for emergencies. I stood there in the dark smoke curling into the breeze and thought about the farmhouse, the well, the bones they'd nearly buried. There was more coming. I could feel it. Savannah had been found. Terry, too. But the truth, whatever was left of it, was still being dug out one piece at a time. They brought Ridge in just after sunrise. 2 plain sedans, no sirens. He walked into the station like he owned the place, chin up, no cuffs. Said he was there to clear up a misunderstanding. Rodriguez didn't look at him, just waved the officers forward and handed him over. They processed him quietly, no announcement, no press. But word spread anyway. By mid-morning, every coffee shop in Alpine was buzzing. Folks who hadn't spoken Savannah's name in years suddenly remembered they always had a bad feeling. Ridge had that effect, made people forget they'd once called him a pillar of the community, made them forget how long they'd looked the other way. Rodriguez told me not to come to the station, said they needed to handle it by the book. No leaks, no interruptions. But he called me that afternoon and said, "There's something you should hear." I met him in the parking lot behind the substation. He sat in my truck, closed the door, and handed me a flash drive. Said it was part of a batch they recovered from the farmhouse, the one where Terry had been held. Most of it was surveillance. Grainy video. Interior shots of rooms. Faces half in frame, names still being confirmed. But this one had sound. He told me to listen with headphones. Alone. I waited until I got home, pulled the shades, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table with an old set of earbuds. The file was 38 minutes long. It opened with static, then a voice. Savannah's. She sounded hoarse, exhausted. You could hear the fear in her breathing, quick, shallow, barely controlled. Ridge's voice followed. Calm, smooth, like he was giving a tour. He told her the rules. No screaming, no questions. Food comes when it comes. The cot stays clean. She was property now. A message. A threat. And if she behaved, she'd stay alive. Then there was a pause, long and quiet, and you hear Savannah ask, "Why me?" His answer, "Because your father made promises he didn't keep." That was the first time I'd heard that part. I stopped the file and stared at the wall. Thought about every conversation I'd ever had with Ridge, every handshake, every lie. When I played the rest, it only got worse. Other voices came in men I didn't recognize. They talked about transport routes, payment schedules, inventory lists. But it wasn't drugs they were tracking. It was people. Young girls, some local. Some moved through Alpine for a night, then gone. Ridge kept notes, dates, drop locations. You could hear him flipping through a binder at one point, telling someone on the other end of the call to burn the old tags and use new ranch codes. It was all disguised as cattle transport, livestock routes through dry counties, no-way stations. I recognized a few of the ranch names, people I'd known my whole life. I sat there in my kitchen, shaking, trying to piece together how deep it all went. I brought the file to Rodriguez the next morning. He'd already heard it, but I needed to say it out loud. That man tortured my daughter, turned her into leverage, built a whole business around making sure no one like her ever came home. Rodriguez said the DA was preparing charges, multiple, state and federal. Said the feds were sending down a special task force to start digging into financials and transport logs. But Ridge wasn't talking. Not yet. And until he did, all they had was what they could prove. Barry was there when I walked in. He looked worse than the day they found Terry. Said his brother hadn't spoken much since being stabilized. Only short answers. Couldn't remember full days, sometimes whole weeks. Trauma fog, the doctor called it, but he did remember Ridge visiting, more than once. That afternoon, Rodriguez got a call from forensics. They'd matched a partial footprint found in one of the storage barns to Ridge's boots. Same make, same wear pattern, same heel abrasion. It placed him at the scene where Savannah was moved in early 2017. That alone wouldn't close the case, but it was enough to get a judge to approve more searches. One of the younger deputies, Marcus, I think, volunteered to go back out with the task force. Said he remembered Ridge sending him on errands to remote ranches over the years. Always last minute. Always with instructions not to ask questions. He started marking locations on a map. By the end of the day, they had 7. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that voice on the recording, the way Ridge sounded when he said your father. I pulled out the old boxes from the hall closet ranch files, land deeds, signed contracts, my father's handwriting all over them. I spent hours flipping through them looking for anything. Buried in a file marked lease renewals, I found a memo dated 2009. It referenced a joint use agreement for a stretch of land near the old riverbed. The signature was faded, but it was Ridge's. My dad had leased him access. Probably didn't think twice. I never knew about it, never saw the renewal request, but Ridge had buried it in our paperwork like it belonged there. That's how far back it went. I brought the file to Rodriguez the next morning. He scanned it, nodded, said it would help establish long-term connection. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. We got an anonymous tip, he said. Caller knew Savannah's middle name, said we missed something. The call came from a burner phone near Marfa. No voicemail, no trace. But the voice Rodriguez thought it sounded familiar. Said it might be one of Ridge's old partners. Maybe someone scared. Maybe someone trying to cut a deal before things came crashing down. The caller told them to look under the floorboards in the main house on the Ridge property. Not the barns, not the sheds. The house. Rodriguez asked if I wanted to come along. I said yes before he finished the question. We drove out that afternoon. Dry heat, loose gravel, a red haze clinging to the horizon. The Ridge property looked abandoned, but the lock on the front gate had been freshly cut. Someone had been there. The house itself was quiet windows coated in dust, front porch, creaking under our boots. Inside, it smelled like old wood and spoiled meat. Flies near the back door. We moved carefully, flashlights sweeping the corners. In the main room where the old fireplace sat unused, they pulled up the floorboards. Beneath them was a crawl space. Shallow. Barely 3 feet deep. But inside, lined in plastic, were boxes. Paperwork, photos, tapes, dozens of them, names, dates, And on top, a ledger book, the kind used by ranchers to track cattle, only this one wasn't about livestock. Every name had a weight, a price, a destination. Rodriguez didn't speak, just took off his hat and stood there in the silence. I stared down at that book and felt everything in me turn cold. Savannah's name was in it, listed twice, once under delivery pending, once under confirmed asset. That ledger was the truth Ridge had hidden for years. Not just trafficking, not just corruption. A marketplace. Organized, repeated, profitable. He'd sold them those girls like animals, and nobody saw it. Or worse, they did, and chose to keep quiet. I backed away from the hole and sat on the floor, knees stiff, heart hammering in my chest. Rodriguez radioed it in, told the others to secure the house. Then he crouched beside me and said, "This is enough. He can't walk away from this." But I didn't answer. I was still looking at the last page. There was a name there I hadn't seen before. One not on the list of known associates. But I recognized it. A rancher from across the county line. A man who used to come by our place every few months for cattle auctions. Always smiling. Always polite. But now I saw his name next to a purchase order, paid in cash, for a girl listed as 17. And that girl wasn't Savannah. The trafficking hadn't stopped. It had just shifted. Quiet, efficient, still moving. Even now, even after everything we'd uncovered, Rodriguez and the federal task force didn't waste time. The morning after we uncovered the ledger, subpoenas went out across 3 counties. 7 names, ranchers, truckers, even a deputy from over in Presidio, all tied to payment trails in the book. Bank statements, cash withdrawals, GPS logs that didn't match patrol reports. One by one, they were brought in. Some denied everything. Claimed the signatures were forged, the numbers a coincidence. But a few cracked early. Said they were told it was protection money. Said they didn't know about the girls. Said Ridge handled all the logistics, they just looked the other way. But that ledger proved more than complicity. It showed timelines, drop points. Some of the girls listed had been reported missing as far back as 2011. One had been filed under a Jane Doe found near Fort Stockton, ruled accidental exposure. Now her name had a purchase order and a destination tag, Del Rio. The case was built slowly, piece by piece. No dramatic arrests, no public show. Rodriguez insisted it had to be airtight. Ridge still wasn't talking, but he was watching. They kept him isolated, gave him the bare minimum. Every morning, his attorney filed a new motion. Delay, suppress, dismiss. But the judge wasn't budging. Not with what we'd found. Still, Ridge had power in places I didn't realize. A reporter out of El Paso leaked portions of the case file, twisted the story, said the tapes were faked, the ledger a hoax, claimed I was framing Ridge because of an old family land dispute. The sheriff's department got calls for days. Some folks even came out to the ranch just to yell from the gate. Said I was lying to ruin a good man, that I was chasing ghosts. But Savannah wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't the only one. 2 families reached out after the leak, said they recognized names in the ledger. One woman drove 6 hours from Odessa with a plastic grocery bag full of notes and photographs. Her niece vanished in 2013, and nobody believed she hadn't just run off. But in that bag was a receipt dated the same day her niece went missing from a cattle supply store Ridge's cousin owned. Written on the back was a name that matched one of Ridge's burner aliases. That bag and the receipt inside it made the case federal. Human trafficking across state lines. Organized conspiracy. Racketeering. Now it wasn't just Rodriguez and the DA, it was the U.S. Attorney's Office. Indictments were drafted. Charges multiplied. By the time the grand jury was done, Ridge faced 27 felony counts. And they weren't done counting. Still, Savannah wasn't back. The girls on the list, the ones whose families hadn't come forward, hadn't been found. Only Terry. only one known survivor. But even Terry had limits. Most days he couldn't hold a conversation longer than 5 minutes. Sometimes he'd forget what state he was in. But one day in late October he remembered a name. He said it like it had just dropped in from the ceiling. Micah. Said Micah used to bring food. Not often, not directly, but sometimes they'd hear his voice from upstairs. Said Ridge didn't like him, that he was family, but soft. Rodriguez pulled every Micah from the Ridge family tree. There were 2. One was dead. The other, Micah Ridge, 32, worked maintenance for a storage company outside Marfa. Never married. No record. Lived quiet. But when agents knocked on his trailer door, he opened it without hesitation. Invited them in. Said he'd been expecting this. They brought him to Alpine that night. No cuffs, no press. Rodriguez called me from the hallway. Said Micah had been cooperative. Said he wanted to talk. I sat across from him in the interview room. He looked nervous. Kept his hands folded, eyes low. Said he'd never touched the girls. Never went near the basement. But he knew what Ridge was doing. Said it started small, just storage runs, cash pickups. He didn't ask questions. Ridge said it was family business. But then in 2018 he saw Savannah. Said she was sitting in the back of a truck, eyes swollen, hands tied. Said Ridge called her the leverage. That's when Micah stopped helping, or tried to. Said Ridge threatened him. Said he had things on him that would ruin his life. So Micah kept quiet. But he left clues. He was the one who tipped off Rodriguez, used a burner, disguised his voice, left that message about the floorboards. That was enough to cut him a deal. Immunity in exchange for full cooperation. And Micah gave them everything: routes, contacts, payment schedules. He led them to a trailer lot near Laredo where Ridge moved girls across the border. Inside, agents found hair samples, duct tape, expired IDs. And in a hidden panel near the floor, they found a red bandana. Micah said Savannah wore one just like it. The forensics team confirmed it had her DNA. That was the first real proof she'd made it that far south. From there, the search shifted. Federal units coordinated with agencies in Mexico. Watch lists were updated. Ridge's accounts were frozen. A few of his overseas contacts went dark, disappeared overnight. But one man, an ex-customs broker flagged in the ledger, was picked up trying to cross into Arizona. He had a notebook in his glove compartment, pages full of names and numbers, and one entry that changed everything: S. Walker. Alive. Hold until transfer. They showed me the notebook. I read that line over and over. It didn't say when, didn't say where, but it meant she'd survived longer than we thought. Long enough to be moved, long enough to still be out there. Rodriguez said it was time to go public, not just with the arrests, but with Savannah's face. Said we had enough, now enough to justify a national alert. So I agreed. The press conference was held on the courthouse steps. Cameras everywhere. Rodriguez did most of the talking. He named Ridge, laid out the charges, said the case was still growing. But when he held up Savannah's photo and said her name, the whole crowd went still. For the first time, they saw her as more than a case file, more than a rumor. They saw my daughter. They saw what Ridge had taken. Afterward, a woman approached me. Mid-50s, quiet voice. Said she worked intake at a border shelter 2 years earlier. Thought she recognized Savannah's photo. Said a girl came through once, didn't give a name, bruises all over, barely spoke. Stayed 2 nights, then vanished. The timeline fit. Rodriguez followed up. Records were sparse. But there was one notation in the intake log: S. Walker TX with a question mark beside it. No contact info, no ID. But it was something. Another thread. Another sign she was still trying to make her way back. Still alive somewhere. And that was the moment I knew we weren't finished. Ridge was in custody. His operation was exposed. The system that kept it quiet had been cracked open. But until Savannah walked through my door, until I could hear her voice again for real, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They found her 6 days later in a migrant shelter just outside Del Rio. She was using a different name, said she didn't remember much at first. The intake nurse noticed the flyer, the one with Savannah's photo, pinned beside the food line. She stared at it for a long time. Then she said 3 words. "That's my dad." By the time I got there, she was already in a room with 2 counselors and a trauma nurse. They told me to prepare myself, said she'd been through things she might never talk about. But when I stepped through that door and she looked up and said, "Daddy," nothing else mattered. She was alive. And that was enough. She didn't remember everything at once. Still doesn't. But little pieces come back. The sound of tires on gravel, a rope cutting into her wrists. Ridge's voice, low, quiet, always behind her shoulder. He kept her in 3 different places, never more than a few weeks in each. Sometimes she'd hear other girls. Sometimes she was alone. She said Micah was the only one who ever left food without shouting. Once he slipped her a bottle of water and whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't know his name then. But when I told her later, she nodded. He was different, she said. He was scared too. The trial lasted 9 months. Ridge pled not guilty to every charge right up to the day the verdict came in. Life without parole. No possibility of release. Micah testified under protection. So did Savannah, though only by written statement. She didn't want to face Ridge in person. Said she needed to speak, but not to him. In her words, she said, "You don't get to look at me. You don't get to know who I became without you." I kept that page. I keep all of it. After everything settled, we didn't go back to the ranch. Too many ghosts out there. Too many corners where I used to wait for her headlights. We live closer to town now. Smaller place, quieter. She's got a dog named Luna, and she's taking classes again online for now. She's not the same, and I don't ask her to be. I'm not the same either. I still wake up before dawn, still expect to hear her boots on the porch, but I've learned not to panic when I don't. I think what stays with me most isn't the fear. It's the silence. The way people look away when you mention names like hers. Like survival is something uncomfortable. Like it's easier to focus on who's gone than who came back broken. But Savannah didn't just survive. She remembered who she was. She found her way through the dark and back to the sound of her name. That's not something Ridge or any of those men could ever take. There are still families waiting. Still girls whose names haven't been spoken in a courtroom. I think about them a lot. Some mornings I walk past the flyer board in the sheriff's office and just read every face, every date. I don't know if Ridge gave them all up. I don't think we'll ever know the full count. But we know more now than we did, and we say their names out loud. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, consider sharing it. Sometimes that's all it takes to bring someone home. One more name spoken, one more light left on.